This is such an honor and a pleasure for me. I was just reminding Rabbi Woznicka how I am connected to Dr. Arnie Eisen, and I'm very fortunate that since 1998, I can call him a teacher and a friend. When I first moved to Palo Alto, as David just mentioned, that was our first post when I was ordained a rabbi. Jacqueline and I moved there. It was before our first daughter was born. I had the opportunity to study Talmud with Arnie each week as part of a wonderful group of a couple of rabbis, some professors from Stanford, the local purveyor of fine Judaica and books in Palo Alto, and we got together every Wednesday morning and studied Talmud, and I learned so much with this group and from the group, and I got to become friends with Arnie, which was really special for me. And then our paths continue to cross. Our daughter Nomi was one of his pupils at the Least College program of JTS and Barnard University, and my niece Grace studied with Arnie as well, so it's just been such a pleasure. And I in my office I have multiple Arnie Eisen books, and I've really enjoyed digging into this one, Seeking the Hiding God. And I had all of these great questions. I have 6 pages of questions, and when we sat down for dinner, I was going to ask Arnie to kind of help me whittle it down. We can't do 6 pages of questions, but it's such a rich book. He said, just ask me one question, and then let's just see where it goes. I said, I can do one question, that's fine. So Arnie, why did you write this book?
Yoshi, I bet I'm not the only person in this room who's had the experience where you know there's something you really should be doing and you're finding all sorts of excuses not to do it. And for the last several years that I was chancellor of JTS, I knew that what I should do is confront the questions of my own faith. That here I had been training rabbis and educators to go out and tell the world about Judaism, and I had been studying and teaching and writing about other people's Jewish thought for close to 50 years. And I never sat down and forced myself to set forth what I myself believed and didn't believe about God and the ultimate questions that we all deal with. And here I finally could not avoid it any longer. I wasn't working 12-hour days, 6 days a week anymore. I wasn't traveling all over the place. I had a sabbatical. It was COVID. And it was the year at the end of which I was going to turn 70. And I don't know if other people in this room have passed that milestone and had this experience, but your sense of time changes. Like the horizon changes. You don't have all the time in the world anymore. And it struck me that if I'm going to do this, if I want my kids to know what their father believes, their father had better figure out what he believes so he can tell his kids. And so I sat down and wrote this book. And I have to say I was afraid of doing it because I was afraid that I would find out that I didn't believe as much as I wanted to. And I also was the chancellor of an institution which, although it's called the Jewish Theological Seminary, has a long and venerable history of avoiding theological questions. Right? And so I was bucking the trend in many ways and sat down and did this, and I found myself loving the enterprise, loving the project. At the end of the day, find myself believing more than I thought I believed, actually. I was actually much more a believer than I thought I was, and much more in love with certain sources in Judaism that are prominent in the book.
I'd love to hear more about that awakening and understanding that you're more of a believer than you thought you were, especially at a milestone age of 70, and especially as someone who has spent his entire career focused on these kinds of theological questions. How did you suddenly discover that you believed more than you thought, and why might that have been a surprise to you in some ways?
Yeah, because the issue was, I'm now basically talking about the title, so let's start with a personal theological essay. I did not want to write another scholarly book. I was about to be 70. I needed to confront this personal question of faith. I didn't want to write another book about what other people think about faith. I'd done that a bunch of times, and lots of articles. Didn't want to do that. And I didn't want to speak in the name of Judaism, and I had been chancellor of JTS for 13 years, and I was giving hundreds of speeches in the name of Conservative Judaism. I didn't want to speak in the name of anybody's Judaism. I just wanted to talk about my own Judaism and my own voice. And I wanted to do it with real humility because I don't think any of us know very much about God. Certainly, I don't know very much about God. And I discovered, as I was struggling with this issue, that there's a major stream of Jewish tradition where some of our major figures throughout the ages are admitting, yeah, we don't know very much about God either. We're struggling, we're seekers, we're looking for the truth about things. And that's why I wanted to use the word essay. And I knew that I was going to fasten on this notion of God being hidden, but I discovered that not only do Jewish thinkers talk about God being hidden, but there's a whole stream of thought where God is not just hidden, but hiding. Heschel has a chapter in Man is Not Alone, his great book from 1954 called The Hiding God. The Holocaust theologian Eliezer Berkovitz, who wrote a great book called Faith After the Holocaust, has a major concept in his thought called El HaMistater, the hiding God. And we know that Nachman of Bratslav, who considered himself the great tzaddik of his generation, Tzaddik Hador, believed that God was not accessible to him, and if God was not accessible to him, it could only be because God was not accessible. So I went from this position of feeling myself unworthy, right? Who am I to write this book? I said Ashrei all the time, and Ashrei assures me that the Lord is near to all that call upon God in truth, and I was calling upon God and not finding God very near much of the time. So that meant I wasn't calling upon God in truth. What did that mean? I wasn't pious enough. I wasn't learned enough. I wasn't observant enough. And my Maimonides, we know, would have told me, Schweig, just keep your mouth shut. You're not a metaphysician. You're not a student of higher mathematics. What do you know? But I realized, no, this is our human condition. We're seekers, and sometimes we find God, and sometimes we have experiences of God, and then we experience God's absence for long periods of time, and precisely that, would be what I would try to capture in the book. So the ambition was, and this is hard, not to say a word more than I could say in good faith, but also not to say a word less than I could say in good faith. Be upfront about what I do believe in the experiences of God that I have had, and not hide behind other people's thinking for a change.
So beautiful, so in some ways revealing, and there's a certain kind of vulnerability, I imagine, as a scholar who's spent his life unpacking and exploring the thought of others, suddenly to be confronting your own and to acknowledge the challenge of it and to acknowledge the beauty of it, joy of it. I wanted to ask you a little bit about that that notion of Hester Panim. So the hiding God, or God whose face, figuratively, is concealed, is hidden. When you think about this theological discovery, this process of discovery that you've been on, how has that changed when you think about what does it mean for God to be hiding, to be hidden? Because if it's an active thing, that God is actively hiding God's self from us, as it were, that raises so many interesting questions. If it's just the reality of the world that we're finite and what could you possibly know? So it's not that God is hiding, but come on, are you kidding? You're as smart a guy as I've ever met, and you can't figure it out. Rav Nachman of Bratslav couldn't figure it out, so it's just unknowable. But the hiding part suggests that God wants to be concealed, wants to not be known. How do you make sense of that?
I don't. I honestly don't. And the standpoint of the book is my experience as a mortal, frail, imperfect human being. To make a statement about God, like what God is doing, I would never have said that God is hiding, except that great authorities like Nachman of Bratslav and Eliezer Berkovitz and Abraham Joshua Heschel said it before me, and that was true to my experience. But what does it mean to say that God is hiding? I don't know. It's the same as asking me the question, how does God hear prayer? What is God doing when God hears prayer? I have no idea. What is God doing when God, in some sense, reveals Torah? I don't know this. I know what my experience of Torah is. I know what the Jewish people's experiences of Torah have been. But what's happening on the other side? I don't know. So one of the things that most provoked my I think anger is not too strong a word. The subject that kind of dominated my field of contemporary Jewish thought for 20 years or more was the Holocaust. And nothing provokes my anger as much as theologians who say with confidence that God did the Holocaust, that God sanctioned it, allowed it, instigated it. And I understand why they said this, because you read the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations, and it's clear that God did that. And you read your Passover Haggadah, and you have these phrases, not by an angel, not by a seraph, but God alone is doing all this. And so when people want to attribute the Holocaust to God, I understand where they're coming from, but frankly, it's obscene to me. See. And then when you find other theologians who pronounce with great certainty, well, exactly what God was doing here and what God was doing there, and God chose to hide here, but then God chose not to hide anymore here. I don't know, and I think we should have a little more humility than that. So once again, I side with Heschel, who had a great line, we are not the Lord's accountants. We are not the Lord's accountants. We can't keep the record of the credits and debits and the attendance and the absences. That's not something that we're capable of. And so the notion of the hidden God, a God who comes looking for you sometimes and you're hiding, and sometimes you go looking for God and God seems to be hiding, and sometimes you don't want God there and God is there, and sometimes, lo and behold, you do want God there and God is there, and you feel that that's a moment of incredible blessing. There are these moments of real presence, of real encounter, and they're fleeting, but you meet them along the way of your life, and it reinforces you on the path that you're walking, which is the path that we Jews call a path of Torah, a path of mitzvah. And so that was really appealing to me, and I discovered, as I was writing the book, you asked me one of the pleasures of writing the book, or one of the discoveries, that certain parts of the Torah especially, and of the Siddur, were living in me to a greater extent than I knew. Because you feel yourself compelled to write this stuff, and you're looking for a voice that's really yours and authentic and true to who you are. I found myself, the phrases in my head, of course they're there. I've been studying Torah since I was a kid. I've been saying, using the Siddur since I was a kid. So these phrases live in me. So the phrase in the book of Deuteronomy from Parashat Nitzavim, chapter 29, verse 28, which ended up being like the theme song of the book, as it were, is the verse that proclaims that the nistarot, the hidden things, belong to the Lord our God. And I interpret that to mean, some of the rabbis thought that we read this right before Rosh Hashanah, so you have your secrets and you haven't confessed them yet, but God knows them. No, I don't read the verse that way. For me, the hidden things are all these things that human beings would dearly like to know. Like, why is there suffering? Why is there evil? How is it going to end? What happens after we die? And none of these things do we know, and I believe we'll never know them. I think Moses doesn't know them, we're not going to know them. But, the verse continues, the niglot, the revealed things, are given to us and our children to do the words of this Torah. So in other words, you don't have the answers to the questions that you want the answers to, but you have enough to live a good life and do some good in the world and do blessing, and you have what you need. And that is what I'm trying to get across in the book, that we don't have these theological answers, but we certainly have what we need. We've got love in this world. We've got community. We've got Torah. We've got wisdom. We've got cultures. We've got a lot of what we need. And I'm trying to reassure people to get out of the paralysis. I think I'm afraid that the answers to the big questions which people don't get have paralyzed a lot of people. And I think we know for a fact that the Holocaust has taken a lot of people away from God, because they can't answer those questions. And I know, since I've been on this speaking tour around the country, so many people tell me their personal stories, and I don't have to tell you, because you've heard the stories yourself. I prayed to God to heal my child did not get healed, I'm never going to talk to God again. It's a very natural human reaction, it's there, and so God loses a lot of conversation partners because of the evil and suffering that are in the world. And so part of my desire in writing this book is to like take God out of this, this conundrum where people are holding God responsible for these things and holding it against God and stopping themselves from pursuing the insights and intuitions that they themselves have that might have taken them closer to God.
There's a line in the book that I especially loved, and I've come back to it now multiple times. It's on page 20, if you have the book in front of you. You write, "There is no surety on anything. That's the nature of faith." And so much of what you just said made those two sentences sort of resonate in me. And then later in the book, you talk about things you are sure about, including your love for your wife, Ace, and for your children. And I know Ace, and I understand 100% why he would love her so. She's such an extraordinary person. And I got to know your kids a little bit, although when you told me how old they are now, I feel like there was a time warp. Something it doesn't add up, even though the math...
Not get any older.
The math works. It doesn't seem to make sense. Right. Yeah. So I'm interested, though, in that tension between, and you referenced it in your previous response, between, on the one hand, we can't know anything. And yet, of course, there are certain things we do know. And some of the things we know, we are 100% certain of. How can both of those things be true, and how do you navigate that tension?
Yeah, so I'll answer the question this way. I knew that the book had to be a personal book because I'm not the kind of person who wanted to write a theology saying, this is the truth, and try to persuade you about the truth. A lot of contemporary Jewish thought, and I could say, by the way, a lot of contemporary Christian thought is not like that. It's more in the nature of witnessing. I'm testifying. I'm sharing whatever it is I think I know about life with you, and therefore I have to share some of the experiences in my life that have given me the confidence that these things are true. My friends kept asking me, my friends who are Jewish but not believers, how is it that you ended up where you did in terms of belief and faith, and we ended up where we did? And I think the answer to that has to be a series of personal experiences. So I'm telling you these experiences, some of them, in the book that I think have made me what I am. And I think that all of us, to do a fancy theological move right now for a minute, are triangulating, that's the word the philosophers use, between three bases of authority, three sources of knowledge. One is our reason, what we think. We have science. We want to make sense of things. Another one is our tradition, which it powerfully fills our minds, my mind certainly. And in Judaism, unlike some other traditions, this tradition doesn't work through big tomes of systematic theology, trying to work out, like for example, how Jesus could be 100% divine and 100% human at the same time. We don't have to worry about that. So our people tends to raise theological questions in the course of holidays. You do Purim, you celebrate Pesach, you're raising theological questions. You celebrate Rosh Hashanah, or certainly you go to Shul on Yom Kippur, you are confronted time and again with theological questions. We tell stories. All of our great texts tell stories. And so I figured, okay, I got to tell some of my stories. And this is the answer to your question. So you triangulate among your reason, your tradition, and your experience. And you get to be 70 plus years old after 42 years of marriage and 30 plus years of children. You better be confident that love is not an illusion, that Freud was wrong about this. Love is not just dressed up sexual desire. Love is real. And in pondering the notion of loving our neighbor, as we're commanded to do in last week's portion, and loving God, I found myself writing paragraphs about what it means to love and what it means to love God. And here I am, the first person to admit that I don't know very much about God, and yet I think that we all can fulfill this commandment to love the Lord our God, not only to love God, but to do it with all our heart and soul and might. And some of the most difficult paragraphs in the book to write, because again, I was trying to be true to what I thought was true, not say a word less or a word more than I could, was talk about love and love of God. And I tell you in the book, I'm going to tell you something that I think is true, and I don't know what it means. I think that the love that we share among ourselves, with those we love, with our spouses, with our children, with our friends, is ultimately love that comes from God. I say that in the book. I say it now with a full heart. I don't know what it means. I believe that it's true. I think the knowledge of what that means is beyond us. How can we understand a mystery like that? Except when you go through life, there are certain faith gestures you make, and one of them is loving. Not just writing books about God, but in loving, you're making a great, perhaps the primal faith gesture, or expressing gratitude, right? Talk about my experiences of growing up in this book and having a father who thanked God every day for being alive after suffering, almost dying as a teenager and being in a coma for a couple of weeks and coming back, and every day waking up in the morning and thanking God that he woke up. That's the formative religious experience that molded me. Before I started studying books and writing books and everything, that's the experience of faith that molded me.
I love that. The comment about love itself is so powerful. And sometimes when I sit with wedding couples, we talk about what it means to love another person and try to understand another person and your love for God. And as you were saying that, I was thinking about these conversations with wedding couples where, we promise to love someone, we make that commitment, not fully understanding what that means,
Right.
not fully understanding who we are,
Right.
and not fully understanding who this other person is at that moment, and knowing full well or coming to discover full well that both of us will change.
Yes.
As the world
And it might not work
evolves.
out. It might not work out.
And there's so many unknowns, and yet in some ways isn't that another example of faith where you
That's
say, and
right.
I'm going to pledge myself to you nonetheless.
And experiencing this and thinking about it the way you just have helps us figure out what it is to love the Lord our God. But the love of God is in a sense not different from that.
There's a beautiful part of the book where you talk about the theology of Chad Gadya.
Yeah.
So ritual and tradition
Yeah.
is the way you weave it into the book. I really, really appreciated. You talk about the Passover Seder, and you talk about other aspects of Jewish life and Jewish living. But maybe just to entice those who haven't read the book yet, because I love that. I love that. And the fact that you take this song that so many of us think of as just part of the Seder, it's this fun way to end the Seder, and it's this silliness, this ate that, and that ate this, and what, and there's a theology to it that's really, really deep. Could you say a little bit about that?
So the book takes off really from the Passover Seder. As I said, I was looking for an authentic voice. And the voice that I found is the voice when I was speaking to my friends, especially when I was speaking to them gathered around our Passover Seder table. And when you have discussions, as we have at our Passover Seder table, you are thinking about this question of, can the world be redeemed, and how are we going to do it? And to my mind, the point is that you're remembering this redemption that was, in order to give yourself confidence that there can be and will be redemption, and to steel your resolve to work toward this redemption. That lefichach, near the end of the Passover Seder, that's the key moment of transition. But you know that one of the problems in achieving this redemption is all the human aggression that's in this world, all the violence, all the selfishness, all the greed. And you know, because sometimes Freud is right, that a lot of this violence and aggression is connected to fear of death. And so, how do we end the Seder? With this ultimate theological conundrum, and we hide it from ourselves by making it into a kid's song where you're going around the table saying all the sounds of the different animals, right? And what's the message of Chad Gadya? That it's only going to end when the angel of death kills the shochet and God kills the angel of death. That's when redemption is going to happen, when God puts an end to the angel of death. What could be more profound than that? So let's laugh and have a good time and drink 4 cups of wine and go out there in the world and live again. And it's wonderful because we want to live. We want to be affirming life. This is the genius of this tradition of ours with this incredible ritual called the Passover Seder. And so you got to go out there and live, but you live with the consciousness. I mean, you leave shul every week with the Don Olam, Biado Akiv Yuchiv, Eitisham Ve'ira. You leave synagogue with the line, God is with me, I shall not fear. That's what our tradition wants us to be able to do. There's so much that's worth fearing in this world, and it wants us to somehow live life and do good without fear. Lo yira, right? And yeah, if you really believe God is with you, there's nothing to be afraid of. So it wants us to have that kind of faith. So that's an example of how I think that our tradition weaves theology into our practices and to the experiences we have, like the experiences of love. And that's what I was trying to get across. So most of the books I read about theology are organized by topic. This is revelation. This is creation. This is redemption. And the writers act as if they know something about these things. And I'm trying to explore it, as it were, from below, the way we all experience it and reflect upon it in our daily lives.
Well, would you be willing to do a little reading?
For this, I have to put my glasses on, but happily.
So it's on page 96, and it relates to what you just talked about. And in the middle of the page, you write, "We who are alive today and feasting at the Seder are unwitting beneficiaries of all that has gone before. The goods of life are not distributed equitably, and neither is life itself."
Yeah.
No, I wanted you to read the next paragraph.
I think my pagination, I have the Galleys copy. I think it's a little different than this copy. So, right, where am I reading here?
Right after the goods, neither is life itself.
How does one face up to bitter truth like this? How do we bear the reminder, just as we are leaving the Seder, having resolved to do our part to work for redemption in the coming year, that we live in a world sustained by the killing of one creature by another? We sing a silly song, our bellies full, our spirits raised by wine and fellowship. We chant Chad Gadya, and by doing so announce our awareness at some level of consciousness that the whole sorry tale of history, punctuated by occasional redemptions large and small, will not fundamentally change until slaughterers stop killing oxen. That won't happen until the angel of death stops killing slaughterers. And for that to happen, the final verse of Chad Gadya must come true. Then came the Holy One, blessed be he, and slew the angel of death. That's when ultimate redemption from the world's evil will arrive and what it will look like. Until then, we must do our best, and there will have to be enough, which of course means Dayenu.
It's beautiful. And the fact that you could pack so much meaning and depth into Chad Gadya and help, I'm sure everyone will have the same experience when you read it, but for me, as someone who has been through a few Passover Seders and chanted Chad Gadya a few times, I never had that insight. I never had that sense of, wow, there's something so much deeper about this. It is the death of death. It is, to quote one of your colleagues from the Jewish Theological Seminary, Neil Gilman, so powerful. And then I was thinking about, and it comes up in the book multiple times, October 7th and its aftermath and the theological questions that raises, not that we needed that to raise those questions, not that we needed the Holocaust to raise those questions. There's plenty of suffering that we could point to that could get us in that place. But here we are, understanding the reality of what does it mean to live in a world where there are those who want to kill us, and sometimes we are in the tragic, sad, painful position of having to kill to protect our own selves and people that we love. And it feels like, boy, the angel of death getting slaughtered by the Holy One is so far away. How do you hold on to hope in the midst of that reality? Because you could read this and say, well, that's it, Arnie, might as well just jump off the side of the mountain, because if we're waiting around for God to slay the angel of death, it ain't happening in our lifetime. So how do you navigate that awareness that that's how the world is, and yet that desire to hold on to hope for a world that's better?
Because there are experiences in your life that are experiences of such powerful blessing and such hopefulness, and there are experiences of justice, and there are experiences of compassion, and there are experiences of love, and they sustain you. They convince you that we can choose life, choose goodness, and choose blessing, just like Moses, promises the Israelites at the end of the book of Deuteronomy in God's name. My friend Neil is here, who has the historical distinction of driving me to New York one day in 1971 to meet Abraham Joshua Heschel, because I had met him when he spoke at my university, and I wrote a story about him, and I asked him if I could come to New York and interview him. And I spent an hour and 45 minutes that day with Heschel, and he changed my life by assuring me that Judaism would be worth my life, that words matter, that religion can make a difference in the world. He assured me of so many things that day. And I have his example in front of me all the time, a man who literally lost almost every single member of his family in the Holocaust. I think one sister escaped too, and he had some cousins in Brooklyn when he got to America. He escaped by the skin of his teeth himself. And yet he's able to write these magnificent books about faith in God. And I first encountered him at the age of 14 or 15, this book, Man is Not Alone, where he gives you this wonderful experience of God in chapter 9 of Man is Not Alone, and you turn the page, and the very next chapter is called Doubts. I love that. So to see this man, I can just picture him sitting in Cincinnati in 1943, 1944, not knowing if his family members are alive or dead in Nazi-occupied Poland, and then discovering that they in fact have not survived, and then going on to do all the things that he did in this life. And I experienced him as calling us. Certainly, if you're going to hear this call, you're going to be a teacher of Judaism. Your job is not to impart information. That's the beginning of your job. You're conveying knowledge. But your job is to imbue another generation of Jewish individuals with this conviction that the world can actually be better, we can make a difference, and life can be good. So one of the reasons you want to be a teacher, as I've always wanted to be a teacher, is you meet young people, you got to have hope, because they have everything in front of them, and they're so idealistic. And you have children, and then, God willing, you have grandchildren, and you have love in your life, and so you can defy Chad Gadya. You can defy. It's not the last word. It may be the last word of the Seder, but you go out of it singing, having a good time. And so you manage. You manage. You get by with a little help from your friends.
You write that at the beginning in some of the conversations. It begins with some exchanges, email exchanges with some of your friends.
Right.
And one of whom is acknowledged in the book, Neil, who you already mentioned. And that's obviously a very powerful part of your own experience and in some ways your own theology. I'm thinking about the moment that we find ourselves in on college campuses, and as someone who was chancellor of JTS and now teaches at JTS, and including undergraduates who are in a program. In order to be in this program, you need to be enrolled also in Barnard or Columbia. Yeah. Places where I can speak firsthand as the father of a Barnard student. It has been a very challenging couple of years. One of the books that I cherish of yours, Zionism, the sequel, includes some fantastic essays by some of the Zionist thinkers of the last 30 or 40, 50 years. How are you making sense of where we are right now, given your understanding, deep understanding of the history of the Zionist movement? Is this a moment that you saw coming on any level? Is there anything about this that didn't surprise you? And I guess on the hopeful side, do you see a way, a path forward that can enable our students to be in these places and feel a sense of safety? Do you see a path forward where some of the maybe pendular shifts on public opinion around Israel will swing back in a direction that would be favorable to us?
That was a lot.
And there's 5 other subpoints to this.
So when I've told you that I'm very uncertain about all these theological questions, it won't surprise you to learn that as someone who's been a student of American Judaism and Israeli Judaism and been involved with Zionist thought and American Jewish relationship to Israel for my entire adult life, I don't think anybody knows right now how things are going to turn out. This is not a moment when we can pronounce upon what the future is going to be. There's just too many variables. But one of the things we know we are not to do, because Israel is not just a historical occurrence, Israel is a mitzvah for the Jewish people. And we're not going to abandon this mitzvah of creating and making this state as good as it can be and flourish. We're not going to give up on it. We're going to keep fighting for its survival and for its thriving and for its blessing. So we can resolve that we're going to do that. I don't know yet what shape that's going to take, because we don't know yet what's coming. Things are changing by the week. Many of you have had the same experience I've had. In the last 2 years, your Israeli friends have been expressing concern about us, like what's going on campus. So I'm worried about them. They're worried about us. I think we have a lot more to worry about with them than they do with us. There'll be some anti-Semitism. We don't know how much, how long it will last, who's going to do. We don't know its picture totally. Things have changed. Everybody I know was shocked by the extent of it, by the people who are carriers of this anti-Semitism. But we've dealt with anti-Semitism before. That's why this to me is not a world-shattering event. It'll bring some American Jews closer to Judaism. It'll take some American Jews into hiding. I don't know the percentages on each side. But if Israel's facing an existential challenge, that's a more fundamental concern for me than the situation of American Judaism. So I think that on both counts, this tradition is necessary, because you got to know who you are. The people who are most harmed by anti-Semitism are the Jews who don't know anything about who they are as Jews. They don't know anything about Judaism. They don't know what their people stands for, what we've accomplished, what our texts say to us. And Israel's future, I don't want to preach to Israelis, they've got enough going on right now, but as lots of people have said about Israel, Israel's future is in relationship to Jewish history and the Jewish tradition. It can't be a Canaanite option divorced from this sort of stuff I'm dealing with in this book, divorced from mitzvah, divorced from texts and communities and trying to bring God into the world. So how that's going to work out, I don't know. Nobody knows. That's one of the nistarot. But we're going to stick with it. And I think American Jews are not going to fail this test. To fail the test would be to turn their backs. I was with a group of Stanford professors last night, and one of the Israeli professors was feeling really betrayed by American Jewish friends who have announced that they're giving up. And I told her, I don't think this is going to be a typical response. In a statistical sample, some people are going to make that response. I really don't believe it's going to be widespread.
Well, certainly we've seen those folks that some people describe as October 8th Jews, who are returning to Jewish life, embracing Jewish life in ways. There's a lot of hope that I find in that. In addition to talking about the Passover Seder, you talk in the book about Yom Kippur and its meaning and the ritual around that. Could you talk a little bit about how that plays into your theology?
I'm smiling because Yoshi knows what this chapter does, so I'll fill you in a little bit about what this chapter does. After Pesach and Shabbat, my favorite day in the Jewish year is Yom Kippur. It helps that I've never had trouble fasting. I think if I was miserable with the fast, I wouldn't like the holidays so much. So that's just a stroke of good fortune. But the thing about Yom Kippur is I love the liturgy, I love the music, and I cannot stand the theology. I do not believe that God is writing in a book deciding who's going to live and who's going to die between now and next Yom Kippur. I want to separate God from the angel of death. It does not help my relationship to God to go into Yom Kippur believing that God might kill me. So I have a member of my wife grew up in a little place in upstate New York called Elmira. And I went to that shul many times and spent many high holidays there. And there was one day when one of the leading members of the congregation was walking back to the shul for mincha and was struck by a car on the street outside the synagogue and killed. God did this. God decided that he's not going to get another year of life, so he has to die before mincha? No. No. So I asked my rabbinical students, when you are saying the prayer Unatana Tokef on Yom Kippur, please contextualize it. Please tell people that this is poetry. This is metaphor. This is not God deciding you're going to die and you're not, and you're going to die by fire and you're going to die by flood. You can't say that in Los Angeles this year, and I hope no rabbi did. But then you get that prayer moves, and in the Siddur that I use, the Lev Shalem Siddur, they actually have the first part of Unatana Tokef on one page, and then you turn the page, and you get one of the most magnificent lines, I believe, in the entirety of Jewish tradition, which is Teshuvah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, Mavirin, Roa Gzera, which I read literally, that Teshuvah and Tefillah and doing justice mitigate the evil of decree. I don't think they cancel the decree entirely. Some people read it like that, but it doesn't say et ha'gzerah ha'ra'ah. It says et roa ha'gzerah, the evil of the gzerah. Even though some of my colleagues at JTS tell me that the literal meaning of that in medieval Hebrew was actually that it takes away the decree itself and not just the evil of the decree. But to my mind, that's profound. You don't know what this world is about. We don't know who's going to live and who's going to die. But these things we do know. We do know that turning yourself toward other people and toward God. And tefillah, whatever you interpret tefillah to mean, however you understand God. And if you can't do tshuva, and if you can't do tefillah with a whole heart, you can always do acts of justice. Tzedakah is always available to you. And that's going to help avert the evil decree. So I have this magnificent liturgy, and I'm trying to get across to people in the chapter how I can love this day so much and not be in tune with one of the major themes that the day is driving home. And I tell the story about how I really came to understand Yom Kippur better when I went to do my PhD in Jerusalem, and my first Yom Kippur there was 1975. And I realized that these thousands of people are not only saying Yisker, they have a yard site. And that changed everything for me about Yom Kippur, that death was a reality for so many people connected to Yom Kippur. And now October the 7th kind of brought that home again. You're going to say Yisker on Shmini Atzeret, you're going to, it's like, so this is a wonderful holiday we have, and it's a holiday that is ultimately joyful. And you read the Talmud, Yom Kippur is a joyful day, right? Because Teshuvah is possible, because God's going to stay with us despite the fact that we're not perfect, maybe because God's not so perfect either.
It's so powerful and so beautiful and so hopeful. The idea
hopeful, yeah, we got another chance.
Yeah, and that it's baked into the tradition, not just on Yom Kippur, but every day.
Right.
We have the opportunity to turn and try to be the best people that we can be. I find it so inspiring and so beautiful. And the way you help us understand Unatana Tokef as metaphor, I think is so important because it's a permission slip in some ways for us, and to hear it from, someone like yourself, to me, feels like, wow, Arnie's encouraging us to look at liturgy more broadly in that way. First of all, we start with the reality that, boy, if Moses didn't even know, and if Rav Nachman of Bratslav didn't know, and Arnie doesn't know, like, what am I supposed to know? Okay, fine. So there's a certain humility that comes with that. But then there's permission given to say, let's look at the words of the tradition and understand it more expansively as poetry, as metaphor. And it's something that Heschel models for us. There's just such a beauty to that. Is that something that you always brought to your davening? Is that something you always brought to the Siddur? Or was that something that just sort of opened up for you in this theological exploration?
No, neither the one nor the other. It's over a period of years, and there were years when I was alienated from davening, but there were years, certainly the last 20, 25 years, when shul is a major part of my life, and I love the Siddur, and I once had at JTS I spent a lot of time with rabbis, right? And there's something the conservative movement calls rabbi camp, where rabbis go to a retreat center for 5 days and talk to other rabbis, and some of us are faculty members, and some of us are there also because I was one of the leaders of the conservative movement, and I wanted to get to know what the rabbis were experiencing. And there was one rabbi there who had a workshop in the evening, and every rabbi was assigned to pick out not more than one line in the entire Siddur. One line, a handful of words, which jumped out at them. And that's where I learned that there are far too many words in the Siddur for us to pay attention to all of them. And what you do is see what speaks to you in color, see what jumps out at you in boldface, and spend time on those words. And those words become like signposts. And for me, they're like friends. I go through the Siddur, and some of it I can't get excited about, but some of it, hey, I have friends here, and these words are my friends. And so what I do for myself and have other people doing is you gradually accumulate a stock of meanings that you've found for these lines. As it were, the metaphor is stereo headphones, and in one ear you're reading the words on the page, and the other ear you're hearing the words that you've made of it over the years. And so the davening comes alive, not every word, not every line, but enough words meet you along the way that you're happy to see again. Right? Every time I meet them, I'm happy to see them again. And they confirm that this is a good path to follow, this path of regular encounter with the Siddur. It's, Judaism is not it's not for leisure time activity. It's meant to be a serious tradition, and the problem is, and I think this is not just a religious problem, I think it's ultimately a political problem. There were a tiny percentage of Americans. This is the price you pay for diaspora, or let's call it galut. And the culture is not yours. And it's either a Christian or a secular culture that dominates America. And so most Jews, as part of being Jews in this time and place, which has been the modern experience generally, are not going to get too serious about living this tradition of ours. They're going to take it, okay, several times a year, or maybe one Saturday a month or something. But the tradition thrives in people who take it much more seriously. And all of our challenge as Jewish educators, Jewish leaders, is to try to get people to make that leap to take it more seriously. And in this book, I try not to preach, but I'm trying to explain, this is what it's meant for me. This is the blessing that I have had. And maybe you'll find something in here that arouses your curiosity that'll make you want to do more of this.
I have one more question I want to ask, and then we're going to give people a chance to ask questions either about the book, if you've had a chance to read it, or about anything that Dr. Eisen's mentioned or any of his previous writing. So I'll give you a chance to think about that, and we'll be able to take a few questions. But a couple of thoughts about what you just said. First of all, there's a great essay by Emmanuel Levinas called Judaism, a Religion of Adults, or a Religion for Adults.
Right.
And I love that. This idea, and it relates so much to your comment that you just made, that it is an adult religion. You have a lot of obligations, and you are constantly a rodef. You're striving for justice. You're striving for holiness, but you'll never get it. And we want God to come and vanquish the angel of death, but it's probably not going to happen in our own lifetimes. That's a very adult way of looking at the world, and the idea that, well, if you just believe this one thing, Arnie, then you're guaranteed heaven, everything's going to be fine.
Yeah,
Judaism doesn't do that.
That's not Judaism. And so, okay, so one more story? We have
Please.
time?
Yeah.
So my wife and I were on a cruise through the Inner Passage of Alaska. And it was a very small boat. There were 60 passengers and 20 crew. And why that's important is because we got to know many of the passengers pretty well. And we had lunch 3 days in a row with a Presbyterian couple from North Carolina. So at one point they asked the question, which other Jews in the room may have heard from Christians, but they said, we've always wanted to ask our Jewish friends this and never had the guts to ask. We're going to ask you, why would you possibly want to worship a God of vengeance and anger and wrath instead of the God of love whom we worship? Right? And I had that fundamental task of education, which Jews have been doing with Christians for a couple thousand years now, and saying that I don't consider our God a God of wrath and judgment, but there's a lot of love in our tradition. And here's the point, that for us, the covenant, mitzvah, the commandment, the obligation, the responsibility, is inseparable from love. Right? So that line, which Jesus quotes in the book of Matthew and says is the center of the Torah, love your neighbor as yourself, we read last week, and so we know is surrounded by things like not taking vengeance and not being a gossip and reproving your neighbor. And the love is not a feeling inside you, it's a behavior between you and among you, right? And so we know that the Torah immediately followed the revelation at Sinai with a portion called Mishpatim. So immediately these wonderful ethical principles about honoring your parents and not murdering and not stealing are followed by, you have an ox and it gores an ox, and what do? Because for us, you said it's an adult religion, ethics becomes serious when it's law, when it's nitty-gritty. That's fundamental to Judaism, and we do love with ethics. And we do ethics with love. And that's why the middle chapter of the book is called Covenants of Mitzvah and Love, and it's not coincidence it's the middle chapter, because Vayikra, Leviticus, is the middle chapter of the Torah. So we have to get this across, and sadly, I keep meeting Jews who believe that their tradition is one of wrath and judgment and not one of love, and who don't see the connection between mitzvah and love, and think that mitzvah ends freedom because mitzvah is all about obedience. And so we've done a poor job. It's not entirely our fault, but some of it is our fault, in not getting across to Jews the nature of this adult religion. Right? It's sad that we have a lot of Jews who've never experienced this tradition kind of in its own terms. They live in a majority culture that's not Jewish, and so they experience their own Jewishness in the terms of this majority culture. That's not a happy situation.
Well, I wanted to say something about your earlier comment about Rabbi Camp, which, by the way, I know for some of you in the room, Rabbi Camp is either your vision of heaven or your vision of hell. You don't have to answer right now. You don't have to answer either, Dr. Eisen. But when you talked about the rabbi saying, okay, what's that verse from the Siddur that really makes your heart sing? I'm thinking, for me, it's from Psalm 100, Ivdu et Adonai b'simcha.
Yeah.
So serve God with joy. And then I was thinking about, you mentioned Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav earlier, and now thinking about a religion of adults. One of my favorite teachings of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, and it's been turned into a really joyous, freilich, happy song. It says, Mitzvah gdola lihiyot b'simcha tamid. It's a great mitzvah to always be happy, which is interesting and ironic because according to many who knew him, he suffered from depression. And so he understood what it was to be sad and to carry that sadness with him in a very heavy way. And so he said, it's a mitzvah, it's a commandment to strive towards joy. But then there's the second half, which is sometimes not quoted, and he says, Simcha gedola, lihiyot b'mitzvah tamid. It's a mitzvah to be happy, and you have to find the happiness in the mitzvah. And so how do we find that place in our lives where we say, a life of obligation, a life of responsibility, a life of pursuing justice, knowing I'm never going to quite reach it, a life of serving others? What could be more joyous than that?
Right. And you find it by experiencing it, not by reading books about it. At most, the books can get you to try to experience it. But if you haven't experienced it, you're not going to know it for yourself, and you've got to know it for yourself. And, life is not always joyful. Come on, we know this. We're adults. We're serious about this. There's a lot of tragedy, as we know, right? How many hostages still have not been released? Come on. This war goes on. So many people are suffering. It's horrible. But there can be simcha, yes. And what a joy it is not to have to invent the path for yourself. Imagine how awful it would be if I had to wake up every morning and figuring out what's the right thing to do today and really take it seriously and worry that I was wasting my time. That would be one of the worst things, to go through life afraid that I was wasting the precious moments that I have every day. And if you have a tradition, it can assure you, do these things and you're not wasting your time. Right? What a joy that is. What a relief that is.
Thank you, Arnie. I wanted to give folks here a chance to ask a question, and all I'll ask you to do is just kind of shout it out, and then I'll repeat it, and for those joining online, they can hear us. So please. Jose.
Thank you very much. Dr. Eisen, you spoke about your own experiences and your own beliefs. I am curious to know what you thought was your reason for being. Why did God create you? Why are you here?
Let me just repeat it real quick for those joining at home. So when you talk about experiences and beliefs, well, the fundamental question, why are you here? Why did God create you?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that question, but I don't think I can. But the answer that we can have is, what am I supposed to do now that I am here? What am I supposed to do now that I am here? And that's where mitzvah comes in, and the command to love comes in. Look, let me say that, since you asked the question, it was a particularly pressing question for me, because not only did my father almost die as a teenager but got to live, but my mother had 2 children born after me. They were both born prematurely in the 1950s, and neither of them survived. So I was raised knowing that I was the one who survived. And my parents imbued me with the conviction, there has to be a reason for this, or you have to live your life in such a way that it's worth that life that you've been given. But my parents never let me believe that I was owed this life, that I owned it. I knew that it was on loan to me, and I had to use it wisely. That's why I am the person I am, is because how I was raised by my parents, ultimately, with those kinds of ethics. And so your question, is meaningful. I taught, when I was at Oxford for graduate school, I worked I studied Puritans, English Puritans from the 16th and 17th centuries. And you may know they were very concerned with the idea of calling or vocation, which is your question, like, why are we here? Because they wanted to know that they were God's elect, that they were God's chosen. And one of them, a man named Perkins, wrote a book called The Treatise on Vocations. And it meant a lot to me. I first read this when I was 22 years old, and it stuck with me. He said, how do you know you're called? When you do work that you love doing, when you do that work really well, and when it's good for the world that you do that work. And so I try to ask myself, are you doing work that you love? Are you doing it well? And is the work you're doing good for the world? In this case, good for the Jewish people, right? Serving God. And that's my sense of calling, and that's my answer to the question, why am I here? Why I'm here is to do this work.
Well, you do it very well.
Thank you.
And I know you love it, and it's good for all of us.
I do love it.
Josh, please.
First of all, Rabbi Yoshi, Dr. Eisen, this conversation is unbelievable. You recorded this, right?
We recorded it. Did we press record? I think we did. I think we pressed record. Right, okay.
This is amazing. I really think so. I want to sit with this and just do it. It's been incredible. I was wondering, when you were talking about your process of putting this book together, and your mind is so packed with, as you said, decades of all the scholars, you have them bouncing in your head on top of the precepts of movements and your particular movement, conservative movement, and what it's telling you about what is fact about this religion. How were you able, what was your personal process? Not having read the book, maybe you talk about this, I can't wait to get it. But how did you strip that away? How did you find the core of your own beliefs, and what was your North Star for figuring out, this is what I actually believe? And did you have some sort of personal litmus test as you would come across those things?
So a question about the way, again, for folks joining from home who might not have heard that, the question of the process and the way of discovering your own truth in writing this book, but more broadly in your own personal theology.
I don't know if I can have an honest answer to the question, because I don't remember exactly what the process was, but here's how it began. I knew I needed to start, I needed to find a voice, and so I wrote a letter to one of my closest friends, a friend from college, a Jewish psychiatrist, loved walking to Yom Kippur services with me, And all the way there and all the way back, he would tell me that he's not sure he believes in the God that he's praying to on Yom Kippur when he's standing beside me in services. I started by writing a letter to him, and then I had the idea, well, it's not just my voice to him that should be in the book, his voice to me should be in the book. So that's when I got the idea of writing the letter from him to me. And so that voice of a Jew, there are many of us who are in shul on Yom Kippur but not sure that they actually believe in a God, certainly not in a God who hears prayer. I wanted that voice in the book. So the prologue became these letters to and from 4 friends. I didn't quite know what I was going to do next, but I imagined myself at the Passover Seder because I love Passover. As I said, I love the discussions around the Seder table. So I decided to do a chapter taking off from the experience of the Seder and the Haggadah. Right? And that turned out to be a pretty easy chapter to write because I've been going to Seders all my life, and you know, I love my family's Seders, and so we did that. And then the question was, what do you do next? And to tell you the truth, I think I wrote the Yom Kippur chapter next because I knew that that was the other major point in the book, that the book was going to have 3 chapters, I decided at that point, and Yom Kippur was going to be the 3rd one. I love the Torah, but the holiday of Shavuot has never been a high point for me, and it's probably also significant that my mother passed away on Shavuot. I did not want to write a chapter on Shavuot. But I decided the book had to have a chapter about mitzvah, and mitzvah had to be connected to love because of this experience of the Presbyterians. So then I had to organize that chapter. And if you read the book, that's where you can imagine the process was the most difficult. Because the Haggadah has a structure, the Seder has a structure, I followed the structure. Yom Kippur has a structure. I started with Kol Nidre. So that had a structure. But what am I going to do to talk about mitzvah and love? So I asked myself, what do I have to talk about with mitzvah and love? Well, if I'm going to love my neighbor, who are these neighbors? And how do I get to love them? And I realized, for me, community has always been a sacred word, a sacred thing. There had to be something about community in that chapter to get me to love. And I recognized that the writings about community that influenced me were not just Jewish writings. There are some Jewish writings about community, and they make their way into the chapter. But for instance, at the beginning of Moby Dick, Herman Melville says fantastic things about community and democracy, and they've always meant a lot to me. And so Herman Melville is there to help me talk about community. And Plato's Plato's Dialogue, the Symposium, has wonderful lines about love that I've treasured since I taught them at Columbia University in 1978. And so I knew that Plato and his dialogue about love had to find a way. So the answer to the question is, I tried to say what I wanted to say, doing some introspection. What's in your head, Arnie? Like, when you think about love, what do you think about? Or if someone asked you to give a talk about love, what would you talk about? And that's what I tried to find. And then you write a whole bunch of stuff down, and you've had this experience. You cut out 2/3, 3/4 of what you wrote, and that's hard because every single word you write is beautiful and gorgeous and brilliant, and you can't bear to cut it, but you've got to, right? And then you're left with this thing, and then some people read it and comment on it, and if it seems good to you and your wife says it's okay, you go with it.
Especially if your wife says it's okay.
Especially if your wife says it's okay, and she didn't like the first draft, so you don't get the first draft.
Right. Ed, please.
Are you getting a smile on your face when you hear the news of the
Of the news of what?
Are you getting a smile on your face when you hear about the new Pope, Leo the 12th?
I'm hopeful.
He's popeful, actually. It's really terrible, sorry. Why, say more about that. What are you hopeful about?
Francis wrote one of the most incredible encyclicals on climate change that has ever been created. I don't know if you all haven't seen it, you should take a look at it, because what he says is climate change is not just about, carbon. It's about a fundamental attitude we have toward the world and toward nature. And until we make tshuva, as it were, and change our attitude toward the world as if it's ours to do with as we please, we're not going to solve the problem of climate change. That's, in a nutshell, what Francis wrote about climate change. And I looked at him, and whenever Whenever I had bad days as the chancellor of JTS, looking at the success and failure of the conservative movement, I took comfort from the fact that the Pope could not do very much with the Catholic Church. You think Jews have problems? Look at the number of Protestants who've lost their faith in America in the last 20 years. It's in the tens of millions. Right? The Catholics, except for the evangelical Catholics, are not doing well in terms of keeping Catholics Catholics. So we face a lot of problems, and I'm hoping this Pope is going to be an ally. It's funny that Jews have a very checkered history with the Catholic Church. And I often found myself believing that if American Christians were more Christian, Jews would be more Jewish. But I also know that if American Christians were more Christian, there'd probably be a lot more anti-Semitism in the United States. So where are we going to go? This is life. I don't know. So I'm hoping this Pope is going to manage to make Christians more Christian and fight anti-Semitism at the same time.
So we have time for just a few more questions, and I do want to make sure that if there's anyone, I see Rabbi, we're going to get to you in 1 second. Anyone who hasn't spoken and wanted a question, we'll do that. Diego and then Rabbi. So Rabbi Gottlieb, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chancellor Eisen. I regret that I was not a student in your class, though I'm not certain that you would necessarily feel similarly about my being a student in your class, but you guys obey. It's very clear, and your point, I think, was underscored, that this is really a personal statement. But if you could step outside of that for a moment, substantively, how much different is your theology as you describe it, certainly in this dialogue, from Mordecai?
So for those of you who are not familiar with Mordecai Kaplan spent many years teaching at JTS, and he was one of the most popular faculty members because he was actually addressing the issues that students had. And he himself did not believe in a personal God, but he prayed 3 times a day, even though he believed that God was a set of forces in the universe. And when I became chancellor of JTS, I said that I have both Kaplan and Heschel in my head, and I consult with both of them regularly. But what I consult with Kaplan about is the nature of the American Jewish community. Kaplan had a profound understanding of the American Jewish community and how to take Jews where they are and make them able to appreciate Judaism as a living force much more. Kaplan does nothing for me theologically, because the God I pray for, happily, is a God I address in second person singular. I'm not happy about the male pronouns, but we're stuck with them in the English language for the moment. But I am deeply grateful for the second person singular, Baruch atah. I would alternate if I could, Baruch atah and Baruch ha'at, but I want that second person singular. I want this personal God because this personal God is part of my experience, and that was not Kaplan. Now, Mel Skolt is a great scholar. Some of you may have heard the name. Mel Skolt has devoted his entire life, and he's now in his 80s, to studying and teaching Mordecai Kaplan. He edited Kaplan's diaries, and he's revealed to us all that the Kaplan you find in your diaries is much more interesting and lyrical, poetic, and prayerful than the Kaplan you find in the books, who's the rationalist, who's busy telling you what no modern person can possibly believe, which is rather insulting, because I do believe those things he said, that no modern person can believe them. But even so, even with Mel Skolt's Kaplan, I'm a Heschel guy, and Heschel, is able to affirm so much despite all the pain that he personally has known and experienced, all the doubts that he's had. And so he licenses us. And if we had more time, you and I did not want to go into this in detail because this is a personal statement and not a theological work. But Heschel wrote a magnificent book called Torah min Hashemayim, Torah from Heaven, where he gathers together hundreds of pages of sources about what it means for Jews to believe in Torah from Heaven. And the lesson of the book is Jews don't agree about what it means to believe in Torah from Heaven. That was a profound lesson for me, right? And I got license from that book. So I'm not outside this mainstream tradition. I found myself really inside this mainstream tradition. And in this book, you get a little inkling of that. But if you're a Kaplan guy, welcome to the fold. If you're a Soloveitchik person, I shouldn't say guy, person, right? Welcome. Even Spinoza, a believer of sorts. Not my kind of believer, but come on, had some good things to say.
Diego, you get the last question. Go ahead. Make it a good one, please.
First, thank you both so much. I appreciate the candor, the curiosity that you bring to theological conversations.
Yeah.
I was hoping to ask you a totally question.
I probably won't know the answer.
Try our best. You brought something really interesting, that we're not God's accountants. I think there's a lot of prayers that put us as God's cheerleaders, and then you also talk about us as God's vessels in expressing love. Having not yet had the fortune of reading your book, I was curious what you think about the operative term in the hiding God. Are we supposed to find him, her, or create that come along? What's your vision on it?
No,
So,
You're gonna repeat the
so
question.
but the last part, Diego, just say it again so I can capture. What is the role? I didn't quite hear it. What is the role of the hiding God?
A hiding God, are we meant to find or create that?
Create. Okay. So when we think about that image of concept of the hiding God, is it our job to be the seeker who tries to find that God or to create?
To create, tikkun olam, making, having
Or some sort of act of tikkun that would bring God into the world, perhaps, and reveal God, maybe.
when I say seeking the hiding God, I'm speaking out of Yedid Nefesh. I'm at Kabbalat Shabbat, which I think is the most beautiful service we have. And it's a service of longing. Right? And I love this image of this soul inside me seeking its soulmate, which might well be the source of souls, right? And the comparable prayer for me, Yedid Nefesh, at the beginning of the Friday night service, is Shira Kavod at the end of the Saturday morning service, where we do it in my synagogue, where you're expressing the familiar truth, but that everything I've just said, all these thousands of words I've just said in prayer, are images. Right? I pictured you, God, not as you are. They imagine you in multiple visions, not in one. And it's important to remind yourself as you're engaged in tefillah, I'm not standing outside of it, wondering if I should come in. I'm inside, and I'm not just inside the tefillah, hopefully I'm also inside the tzedakah and the tshuva, or let's call it, I'm inside the mitzvah. I'm trying to practice. So, yes, we're supposed to do tikkun olam, but we're guided. We have not only our reason, we have our tradition, and we have our personal experience, and sometimes those things diverge, but sometimes they jibe. And I'm trying to testify to sometimes they're apart, and I can't make sense of this, but sometimes they all come together, and I'm able to feel whole. And that precious experience of doing something b'chol levavcha, and b'chol nafshecha, and b'chol modecha, all your heart, and all your mind, and all your soul, and all your might, and having that somehow connected to God, that's a high point of life. It doesn't come all the time, but it comes sometimes. And it's out of that experience, I think, that we do the best that we do.
Arnie, I want to just conclude with one paragraph, and if I could ask you to get your glasses on again
Okay.
and read it, because I want to hear it in your voice. But one of the things that I love about the book and about your writing more generally is the poetry of it. And one of my favorite things you said tonight is, I'm a Heschel guy, which is fantastic. So I'm going to give you this copy because it might not be the same pagination.
What are you on?
It's page 77.
Page 77, and it starts,
The
paragraph
iconic
begins.
picture of Heschel marching by King's side. So you're
I have
writing- Oh, you have
I
it.
have it.
So just to set it up, you're writing about that picture that many of us have seen of Abraham Joshua Heschel standing side by side with Martin Luther King Jr. as they march in Selma. And with that image in mind, you share a bit of your theology.
And I'm going to read two paragraphs. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, I wanted you to do those two.
Good. The iconic picture of Heschel marching by King's side in Selma in 1965 meant everything to me as a teenager. It was living proof that Judaism mattered, that religion mattered, that God mattered. I could not expect God to intervene to prevent violent attacks on civil rights demonstrators, but I could and did believe that God, who is just and merciful, was standing with the marchers in their struggle for justice. They could be confident of this because they were standing with God, whose will was unambiguously expressed in the Torah and the books of Israel's prophets. This, I believe, is how God figures in history, shaping the lives of individuals, communities, and movements. We are impelled to action by the words of the prophets and strengthened in our conviction by those who, like Heschel and King, bring the prophets to life. Moved and strengthened, individuals perform acts of redemption that alter the world and may prove one day to help save it.
Thank you, Arnie.
Thank you, Yoshi. Thank you all.
Please come into the foyer for... Please join us in the foyer, get a copy of Arnie's book. He'll be glad to sign it. You can ask a question or two. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and thank you, Rabbi Woznicka, for making it all possible.